Hi, I'm James Yost, and my presentation for Forestry 375 is on crop types found near cereal cyst nematodes. So for my hypothesis, I thought that cereal cyst nematodes should have a spatial relationship to the types of crops that are grown near them. Thus, using the chi-square analysis, there will be a statistical significance in regards to the frequency of different crops that are grown near areas where cereal cyst nematodes have been collected. So the data that I used was the biotic cereal cyst nematode point data that was collected in 2010, and then the same data that was collected in 2011. This data was available thanks to Tim Politz from Washington State University, and then I collected data from the USDA, and that was the cropland data layer from 2010 and 2011. And so here are the two maps. On the left is the map for the cystic nematodes that were found in 2010, and then on the right are the cystic nematodes that are found in 2011. And so this is a model of how I got my data. So I took the biotic cereal cyst nematode point data and I created a 200-meter buffer around them. And that's what the first green circle is. I then took that 200-meter buffer zone and the cropland data layer from the same year, and I clipped it so that I got the cropland data information that was only within the 200 meters of where the biotic cereal cyst nematodes were found, and that's where the second green circle appears. I then did a frequency to be able to create an attribute table that just showed the frequency of different crops that were grown within 200 meters of where the cereal cyst nematodes were found. And then I did that for the second year also. So then I took that information that I got from those attribute tables and I did a chi-square analysis on the top 10 crops that were found near where cystic nematodes were discovered. And so to do that, I did the observed values minus expected values squared divided by expected values. And so for the first time that I did a chi-square analysis, my expected values were simply, I added up all 10 crop types, and that's where the total comes from, and then I divided it by 10 to get my expected value. And as you can see, my chi-square values were extremely high, and then with 9 degrees of freedom, I had a very, very, very low p-value, less than 0.001, and so that's most certainly statistically significant. However, I realized that assuming that all the expected values would be equal was an improper assumption to make, just because there might be more crops that are grown than others. For instance, maybe wheat was just grown more than the other, and that's why we found them near wheat more often. So I decided to try and take that into consideration. And so for 2010, 2011, and then both years combined, I added up the total amount of the crop types, which is found in the bottom, and then I got the percentages of each of those crops. So for instance, for winter wheat, I take the 354,581, and then I divide it by the total, 3,643,984, to get the percentage, which would then be 9.7% of the total crops were wheat, winter wheat, that is. So I took those percentages, and I took those percentages, and then I took the totals for the top 10 crops that were found within there, and I multiplied the totals by those percentages to be able to get a expected value that takes into consideration the fact that different crops are grown in different amounts. So for instance, I took the 9.73% of winter wheat and I multiplied it by the total of 1,089 to get an expected value of 105.97. And so I did that for 2010 through 2011 and then both years combined. I went through and made my second chi-square, which you can see here, and I kept the first chi-square mainly because I found it interesting that this chi-square, taking into consideration the fact that different crops are grown in different amounts, is actually more statistically significant than the previous chi-square. So I just found that very interesting. And then my final slide just shows a chart of the top 10 crop types that were near 200 meters of where the cereal cyst nematodes were observed. And so you can definitely see that the winter wheat and the spring wheat were the most common ones found where cereal cyst nematodes were found. And so that about sums up my presentation. Just one thing that I would like to make a note of is that there was still a couple more assumptions that I had to make. The first one is I had to kind of make the assumption that they did a proper random distribution of their collection sites, because if they, just specifically collected in only wheat, then obviously wheat would be much higher. And since I didn't have that information, then I just had to kind of make that assumption, and that just goes to show you the importance of metadata, because knowing like how they do that sort of thing would really help in me learning how to apply the data that was given